Dating today is really rough, and the movie Obsession gives us a really twisted view into what happens when someone becomes so afraid of rejection, vulnerability, and emotional honesty that they would rather force love into existence than risk hearing the word no. The horrors of modern dating are the beating heart of the indie film Obsession, a psychological thriller that blends folk horror and monster horror and relationship anxiety into something that feels surprisingly relevant for modern audiences. On the surface, this is a classic be careful what you wish for horror story involving a cursed object called the One Wish Willow. But beneath that supernatural setup, there is a film about loneliness and emotional paralysis and the growing inability that people have to honestly connect with one another in modern society where group hangouts feel emotionally safe, but often limit opportunities for intimacy. While Obsession absolutely delivers escalating horror through building moments of dread and suspense and disturbing imagery, what lingers in your mind afterwards is not the horror itself, but the uncomfortable realization that emotional fears driving this story resonate deeply with us at a level that we try not to think about. And before we go any further, if you enjoy thoughtful discussions about storytelling, psychology, and deeper themes hiding beneath the genre that we're talking about at any given moment within a film, please do give this review a thumbs up and subscribe. But more than anything, please do let me know what you think about dating today down in the comments. Is it harder than ever? Is it a real horror show out there? Or is it going great? I'm just curious because this film is all about that topic. So, Obsession, it is written and directed by Curry Barker, and the story centers on Bear, a lonely and emotionally awkward young man who has been quietly in love with Nikki for years. Although he clearly wants a relationship with her, he can't bring himself to tell her how he feels, and after failing to confess his feelings during a late night drive home, he uses a supernatural object known as the One Willow to wish that Nikki would love him more than any other person in the world, only to discover that the horror of his wish actually comes true. At first, Nikki suddenly seems so much more affectionate and emotionally attached to him, almost immediately. And it just feels like something is wrong with her because her behavior becomes erratic with these wicked emotional swings between affection and instability. And there are these moments when it feels as though Nikki is briefly fighting her way through the spell before losing control of herself again. That loss of identity within this relationship becomes one of the most disturbing elements in the film because Obsession understands something fundamentally important about love, which is that love without choice is not love at all. And the moment that Bear takes Nikki's ability to choose away from her because he is too afraid to say the words when she asks, the relationship immediately becomes monstrous. What makes Obsession especially effective as a film is that it does not intentionally present Bear as evil. He's just insecure and he's lonely and he's sympathetic. And he just comes off as this really emotionally shy man. But somehow his desperation for connection feels understandable. And that's what gives this film its tragic quality. Because Obsession is not really about a villain manipulating someone for pleasure. It is about a person so terrified of losing the thing he wants that he tries to bypass the hard work and the emotional honesty to get it. This is where the film really captures the scary mess that is modern dating. especially for younger people who increasingly protect themselves from emotional harm while struggling to build these meaningful romantic relationships. Many people now fear rejection and humiliation or even social embarrassment, while others have become increasingly guarded about who they trust and who they're willing to connect with emotionally, because those things matter. The result is people tend to go out in groups of friends rather than on solo dates. And that limits the romantic dynamics, making it uncomfortable for people to date within the group where they actually feel safe and they have people that they really like. And it's just really unfulfilling. This is something that obsession absolutely nails. And obsession turns that emotional paralysis into horror by recognizing that there are people right now who desperately want love and human connection, but genuinely they do not know how to emotionally reach for it in a healthy way because we haven't been teaching that to people. And that is where this film becomes more than just another supernatural horror story. Instead, it evolves into a metaphor for emotional suppression, fear, and just the destructive consequences of trying to control intimacy instead of earning it through the hard work of just being honest. One of the smartest things that Curry Barker does as a director is reinforce these themes visually through the cinematography and the staging. This is how the film repeatedly mirrors Nikki's fractured identity and Bear's growing panic. The result is a film where the audience never really feels safe, and more importantly, most of the horror, it's not built around cheap jump scares, but uses anticipation, emotional inevitability, and the growing realization that this situation is becoming increasingly impossible to undo. The film uses a small number of locations, and there are these clear Hitchcock influences throughout the film, especially the use of chiaroscuro lighting, which creates strong contrast between light and shadow that place Nikki partially in the shadow while her movements become increasingly unnatural and erratic. At times, she moves naturally. But in the next moment, her movements become kind of stiff and off kilter, as if control of her body is being puppeteered in real time, causing her body language to shift between recognizable humanity and something deeply unsettling. There's also a fantastic use of negative space inside Bear's house specifically, where empty darkness fills portions of the frame, while isolated light sources might glow in the distant rooms, creating these constant feelings that something is dangerously off and something dangerous might exist between the visible and the shrouded spaces within the scene. The score works beautifully alongside the cinematography to reinforce that tension. Discordant sounds, repetitive musical rhythms, and the eerie whistle that is connected to the One Wish Willow, they all contribute to the odd tonal shifts in the film, eroding the feelings of normalcy and safety that amplify those moments of shock that come up. Overall, the blending of cinematography, the score, the atmosphere, and the pacing, it's all kind of coming together to create this really beautiful craftsmanship. And rather than leaning heavily on the digital effects, the film uses makeup, physical performance, and tactile horror elements paired with thoughtful cinematography to make the supernatural feel intimate and physically present in the scene. The horror feels connected to the actors and environments rather than being kind of layered artificially on top of them. Thematically, the film is juggling a number of ideas, including obsession and love, loneliness and social anxiety, dishonesty, emotional cowardice, consent, identity, accountability, and justice. I mean, what doesn't this film address in some way? But what impressed me most is how naturally all of these themes just blend together because everything grows outward from Bear's original inability to express himself, to be vulnerable, to be honest. As a result, the horror expands outward, first beginning with Bear and then Nikki before expanding slowly to impact their surrounding friends group, changing the emotional dynamics between everyone involved. That expansion, it really helps the story feel larger than just this simple cursed romance. While there are definitely moments of dark comedy throughout the film to kind of help release some of that tension, the humor usually comes from discomfort rather than relief. There are scenes where you laugh because the emotional situation has become so wrong and so socially horrifying that your brain almost does not know how else to process it. Since both Bear's and Nikki's performances feel emotionally authentic, the supernatural elements here are far more disturbing. Michael Johnston does a solid job portraying Bear as emotionally fragile and romantically immature and increasingly overwhelmed by these consequences of his actions. He never plays Bear as cartoonishly malicious because Bear ultimately feels like someone who desperately wanted to love and be loved by the girl of his dreams, who actually may have loved him back if he had given her a chance. And that is the part of this story that cuts so deeply. However, the standout performance in this movie belongs to Inde Navarrette as Nikki, whose physical performance becomes one of the film's greatest strengths because of the way she shifts emotional states so deftly, and she transitions between different movement styles and nails her vocal and facial outbursts and those moments of affection and fear and obsession. There are moments where Nikki genuinely feels trapped inside her own body, briefly regaining fragments of control before the spell violently reasserts itself on her. The culmination of these elements is why the film's emotional core ultimately lands. Obsession acknowledges how difficult dating is today and how finding real love requires vulnerability, honesty, and emotional risk, while the attempt to control love ultimately destroys the very thing people are trying to acquire. The film isn't without flaws. Some of the supporting characters would have benefited from deeper development. And there are moments when obsession pulls from overused supernatural horror tropes that seasoned horror audiences will likely identify pretty quickly. I also found myself occasionally distracted by one part of the curse's internal logic because once the film establishes the specific condition required to break the spell, my fantasy and science fiction brain, as well as my scientific brain, immediately began considering loopholes and ways to get out of it, alternate solutions that the character never seriously explores. And I am trying to avoid spoilers here, so I'm not going to go any deeper than that. It also became painfully apparent that if Bear had just been honest with his friends about what was happening with Nikki and what was happening with him, they could have helped or at least been prepared for the coming chaos. Still, the eventual payoff was strong enough that the film ultimately worked for me. And I think audiences are either going to love or hate this movie, depending on what they want out of this story. What impressed me most is how the ending leaves you feeling unsettled, sympathetic, relieved, and ultimately saddened, and maybe even a little angry at the story and how it builds toward this inevitable conclusion that somehow feels both right and wrong at the same time, only to shift again in its final moments to leave you devastated for everyone involved. This is what makes Obsession memorable long after those credits roll. So, does this mean Obsession is a ticket worthy film for horror fans and dark romantics? I gotta say, yeah, I think if you're into that kind of movie, this is it for you. I think the audience who's ideal for this film is really fans of horror. I also think that if you are interested in a metaphor about the dark state of modern romance or the dark state of modern dating and romance as a whole, you will find a lot in this film that will resonate. I mean, It's kind of like a dark, twisted Romeo and Juliet in its weird way. I'm not sure this is the perfect date movie, but it'll sure give you a lot to talk about if you use it as a date movie. If there is a moral to the story, it is to be emotionally honest with the people you care about and to take a genuine chance on love through vulnerability and honest communication rather than relying on manipulation and cheap tricks to pull someone into a relationship because those choices rarely end well for anyone involved. And when people become emotionally disconnected from themselves, intimacy and honesty become almost impossible to sustain. And that emotional truth is ultimately what gives this horror its power and makes obsession feel so socially relevant right now. Thanks for being here, everybody. And please do give this review a thumbs up and subscribe if this helped. And let me know in the comments below what you think about modern dating right now. Is it harder than ever, or are people kind of figuring it out? And while you're here, there's a couple more reviews here for you to choose from if you'd like, and let me know what you think. All right, that's it for now, you guys. Happy viewing. I will see you all again soon. In the meantime, bye for now.